Welcome to Wildflower Weekly with Ashley Adair. I'm Ashley, and I work as an agriculture and natural resources educator in Montgomery County, Indiana. Going outside is a great way to keep mental health in good shape during the COVID-19 pandemic. Just remember to follow all physical distancing guidelines as you make your way outdoors. This week, we'll bring you the latest in the world of wildflowers and provide some updates on plants we saw last week. The trees have yet to fully leaf out, and the forest floor is definitely showing it. You can see a green blush taking over, which is denser in some areas of this image than in others. If you take a look over toward the left side, you can really see all of the green leaves starting to push forth through those leaves on the forest floor. For those of you joining us for the first time, a spring ephemeral is a woodland plant that completes its above-ground life cycle in a short period of time, usually between March and June in Indiana. These plants provide many benefits to woodland animals at this time of year, serving as a food and nectar source for insects and larger animals alike. If you like, please take a look at our video from last week that describes some of these plants in more detail. So let's set the scene. We're back at McCormick Woods at Purdue Managed Property near Purdue's campus. This week we walked on Wednesday, April 1st. The weather was 57 degrees Fahrenheit and partly sunny, but the sun grew stronger throughout our walk. This property is open to the public for hiking and mountain biking and is partially managed by a mountain biking group here in Tippecanoe County. Here we're looking at the south entrance adjacent to the Ahkam Allen Golf Course. You can really see some of those green leaves poking through last year's fall leaves on the forest floor. This week's weather has been warmer on average and a bit more volatile. Yesterday morning, we woke up to frost and a temperature hovering around 36 degrees Fahrenheit at our home. Looking back at the early part of the week, Sunday saw very warm temperatures followed by a nosedive as a cold front passed through. With that cold front also came high winds. Notice that the spring ephemerals we see this week show no sign of wind damage from this big weather event. It's worth noting that if you are either a bit farther north or a bit farther south than where I'm walking, indicated by the star on Tippecanoe County on this map, that you may be noticing different stages of development in your wildflowers. They say that spring moves 15 miles north every day, and I think there's some real truth in that when it comes to average climate conditions. That being said, let's walk. Here's a plant hunting tip. As you walk in the woods, a good place to look for spring ephemerals is on south-facing slopes. These slopes tend to be some of the warmest spot in the woods because they take on so much sunlight during the day, so definitely keep an eye on them on your weekly walks. Here's how it works. Each slide has information organized in a particular way. Here is the photo, here is the scientific name, and here is the common name. Below the common name, you'll find some interesting facts about the plant, how it's pollinated, its role in the ecosystem, and other information. This week, we've added an update to show you what's happening with a flower that we saw last week. We're starting out with Claytonia virginica. Here in this image, you can see that they've been popping up in greater numbers and they're starting to colonize certain areas. A good place to find them is near the base of trees like this one here. Occasionally, some of them have weird flowers. Most Claytonia flowers have 5 petals, but this particular individual has 6 petals. You'll also notice in the image on the left that some Claytonia plants can get really, really big. This one has particularly large leaves. Next we have Viola sororia, the common violet. Not much has changed with the common violet this week. We're not seeing any flower buds, but we'll keep an eye on it for future weeks to see when those flowers will start blooming. Here's a new plant for the week, Sanguinea Canadensis, otherwise known as bloodroot. Bloodroot is a member of the poppy family. The juice from the rhizomes is bright red in color and was used by Native Americans to produce a red dye. This plant attracts many different types of pollinators, including several different species of bees, syrphid flies, also known as sweat bees, and beetles. The seeds have a unique structure called an elaiosome, a fleshy and nutritious structure that encourages ants to harvest and distribute the seeds. Many other spring ephemerals employ this process, known as myrmecochory, to distribute their seeds. Bloodroot plants are highly variable across individuals. The leaves can have many different numbers of lobes, and the flowers can have 1 or 2 or sometimes more sets of petals. This is one of my favorite spring wildflowers because of this variation. It's also unique in that it has the one single leaf that kind of looks like a flag once the flower starts to wither away. Our next new plant is Allium tricoccum, otherwise known as the wild leek. It has many other names, including ramps, spring onions, ramson, and wood leek. This is a member of the Amaryllis family and the Allium genus, so it is a cousin to traditional garlic and onion that we cook with. These plants are considered a popular traditional food in springtime and can be used to flavor many different types of dishes. However, it can sometimes be confused with lilies, which are poisonous, so don't harvest and eat this unless you know exactly what the plant is. If you do choose to harvest, do not harvest entire bunches. It's a good idea to leave a few leaves behind so that the plant can still form a flower stalk to produce seed later in the summer. Here's another update for you, an update on cutleaf toothwort. This plant is named for the variable leaf shapes and the shape of the root. You can see some of the variation in those leaf shapes in the image to the left. We're seeing quite a few of these plants emerging this week, and some of them are getting really tall. This plant has flowers that close up when it's cloudy, cool, or too dark outside, which you'll see in these next images. On the left is a toothwort plant that has flowers that are slightly open, but not very open, considering how cloudy it was at the time the photo was taken. On the right, the only flower that's blooming, which you can see right behind one of the cut leaves, is almost completely closed. Another new plant this week is Podophyllum peltatum, otherwise known as mayapple. These plants are fun because they look like little patio umbrellas as they're coming out of the ground. Sometimes they're associated with morel mushroom hunting, but I can't say that there's a whole lot of truth to morels growing under mayapples. I've personally never found one under there, but if you have good luck with that, then I encourage you to keep on doing it. This plant, once it forms a flower, is visited by many different types of pollinators, and the fruit, once it forms, is a choice food source for box turtles. These plants tend to form large colonies. This member of the barberry family sometimes has 2 leaves. Mayapples with 2 leaves are considered mature mayapples, which will form flowers. It takes about 4 years for mayapples to fully mature. We'll keep an eye on these to watch out for flowers and fruits over the next few weeks. It's time for a Trillium update. This group of red Trillium seemingly popped up together overnight. There's more variation among the Trillium that were found this week, and some of them have very dark leaves. These are 2 of the darkest Trillium individuals that I think I've ever seen, let alone seen in these woods. Many of them are starting to form their flower buds, so we'll check back in the next week or 2 and take a closer look at what those flowers look like. Another new plant this week is Geranium maculatum, the wild geranium. This is one of the showier spring ephemerals that we'll see in these woods. The flowers are attractive to bees, butterflies, skippers, and flies. Chipmunks are known to forage for the seeds, and occasionally you'll see white-tailed deer foraging on the leaves themselves. The flower for this plant is a blush pinkish purple color. They're very attractive. Wild geranium is fairly easy to cultivate in the home landscape and can be a good candidate for native landscaping, especially because it has that nice showy flower. Trout lily update. Trout lilies have been more numerous in the woods this week. There are probably a couple of different species of trout lily among these groupings, but in the image on the left you can see that most of them are just single leaves popping up. Mature flowering plants have 2 leaves. This member of the lily family really starts to show its roots, if you will, with the flower bud. Notice how it's drooping. Once it opens up, it'll look very reminiscent of familiar lily plants that you might plant in your home landscape. We'll check back next week and hopefully see many trout lilies blooming. Then we'll know for sure whether they're yellow trout lilies or white trout lilies. Our next plant is Florkia proserpinicoides. This is the false mermaid weed. It's a common inhabitant of moist and shady forests like McCormick Woods. However, it's the exact opposite of a showy plant. The flowers are white and they're extremely tiny. We'll try to take a closer look at those in the coming weeks. This plant tends to form carpeted areas and may be found near colonies of trout lily. As it turns out, the cress we were seeing last week was largely purple cress. This is a member of the mustard family. We also determined that some of the cress we were seeing last week is spring cress, which has white flowers. Our next new plant this week is Hydraphyllum virginianum, otherwise known as Virginia waterleaf. This plant has conspicuous, low-growing leaves and has light green-gray patches on a background of darker green. Essentially, the leaves look like they have been watermarked. This plant produces a unique and conspicuous cluster of flowers later in the spring that will attract a wide variety of bees and flies. We'll keep an eye out for it in the coming weeks. Shrub Alert! Here's an update on spicebush, Lindera benzoin. This plant is known as Forsythia of the Wilds for good reason. It's a member of the laurel family. We talked last week about how you can identify this shrub by scratching the bark with a fingernail. Now that they're flowering, they're a lot easier to pick out of the crowd. In the image on the left, you can see that the ant is taking advantage of early season nectar and pollen reserves. You can really see the spicebush blooming in earnest in this photo. The gold blush in the woods is coming from this shrub. Occasionally, we'll see interesting bugs in the woods, so we'll give you a bug alert. This particular bug is from the Dinothrobium genus. This is known as a red velvet mite. This bug is actually an arachnid that has 8 legs, but it's not a spider. It's commonly found in moist areas, and it's easy to spot because of its bright red color. These mites are hunters of insects, insect eggs, and arachnid eggs. It's also associated with moisture, so you'll tend to find it in shady, moist woods like the ones we've been walking in. Here's a harbinger of spring update. This member of the carrot family is completing its flowering cycle this week. Notice how the anthers, the little dark structures above the white petals, have turned much darker than last week, giving them more of a pepper and salt appearance than before. Here's an oddball for you. This new organism is called a lichen. You may have seen lichens growing on trees in your home landscape in the past. Lichens are composite organisms, which means that they're made up of algae, bacteria, and fungi that are all living together as one organism. Lichens are not plant pathogens, so they can't kill trees. They live in a wide variety of environments and live on living and non-living surfaces. Essentially anywhere they can get purchase, they can colonize. So they can live on boulders, bricks, trees, pretty much any surface you can imagine. They're considered pioneer organisms, which means they're some of the first organisms to colonize disturbed areas. Lichens are taxonomically complicated, so I can't tell you exactly what scientific name either of the species in this picture has. Most of the time, their scientific name is derived from the fungal component of the organisms. Regardless, they're extremely fascinating and extremely hardy organisms. I hope that lichens might spark your curiosity about living things, and I encourage you to do a little bit more research on them to learn more. Diecerra update. This member of the fumitory family might start looking more familiar to you as the flowers start to form. You'll notice that they bear a similarity to a commonly cultivated ornamental plant known as bleeding hearts. Once the flowers start to mature, we'll show you the comparison between the two. Hopefully by next week, we'll know if these Diecerra plants are Dutchman's Breeches, squirrel corn, or maybe a little bit of both. If I had to make my guesses, I would say that the plant on the left is Dutchman's Breeches and the one on the right is squirrel corn. Notice the direction the racemes, or flower stalks, are taking. On the left, the raceme is bending to become parallel with the ground. On the right, the raceme remains upright, perpendicular to the ground. Although these species are nearly indistinguishable based on their leaves, their flowers are in fact quite distinct. We'll check back for sure next week and see what we've got. Another new plant we saw this week is Trillium flexipes, otherwise known as drooping Trillium. This is a second species of Trillium found in these woods, which is much larger than the red Trillium, both in height and flower size. We'll check back during the next 2 weeks to watch its progress. We've also got ferns that are starting to come up. Ferns are spore-producing plants, which means they don't produce flowers. Instead of flowers, you'll see small groupings of spores on the underside of the leaves. Indiana is home to more than 15 different species of fern, and they tend to be common in Indiana forests. We won't know exactly what kind of fern this is until later in the season. Ferns that are commonly found in McCormick Woods and other woods like it include the rattlesnake fern and the southern fragile fern. Some other common ferns include the Christmas fern, which you might have seen in woods near you, which stays green even in winter, hence its name. Ferns with more tender foliage, like the one seen here, begin to emerge in early spring. Ferns are a delight to watch in early spring because of their fiddleheads. Fiddleheads are tightly wound, immature leaves of ferns, as seen here. Some species of ferns are desirable for eating. You can cook fiddleheads at home as if you were cooking asparagus. However, it's only a good idea to eat foraged items if you know exactly what you're consuming. Now it's time to dive back into those invasive species that we saw last week. Our Asian bush honeysuckle is pushing leaves out rapidly with these warming temperatures. We'll return next week to look at the leaves more closely and keep an eye out for blooms. I'm not removing these species as I see them when I'm walking in McCormick Woods because the forestry department conducts research here and I'm not fully aware of what I should and should not touch, so I'm leaving this one be. If I were elsewhere, especially at home, I would yank this out of the ground in a heartbeat. Garlic mustard hasn't changed too much this week, but as a reminder, this member of the mustard family looks a little bit like violet at this stage. Even though the plant itself hasn't developed too much more, I definitely saw more individuals coming up than in the week before. Soon they will start producing flower stalks, so we'll make sure to update you on what those look like when we start seeing them. As a reminder, if you're pulling up garlic mustard, you should grasp the plant at the base to pull it up. Otherwise, the plant could break off at the root. As a reminder, some resources that are shown here are very useful for learning more about invasive species in Indiana forests. I also wanted to point out an excellent resource for wildflower and fern identification here in the Midwest. Michael Hamoya's Wildflowers and Ferns of Indiana Forests is a great resource to have on hand with excellent photos to help you learn more about the wild plants in our forests. You can find this book and other interesting books at IU Press at the link shown below. Tune in next week. Stay safe and practice physical distancing and make sure to get outside when you can.
Thanks for joining me for Wildflower Weekly. We'll see you next time.